I want to begin by thanking Dag Spicer and all of my colleagues here at the Computer History Museum for having me. I've lived on the West Coast now for almost 10 years, and it has been my dream since arriving to give a talk here at this museum. So it's a pleasure to see you all. So I'm going to be speaking today on the near anniversary, I guess, 3 years ago, the anniversary 3 years ago when Edward Snowden, a CIA employee, leaked documents revealing the US government's extensive surveillance of foreign and domestic phone calls. And on the anniversary of this explosive disclosure, as we've seen in the media over the last few weeks, media outlets are revisiting the questions of data privacy and civil liberties. What the world is missing is the way in which surveillance technologies have evolved and extended past their current capacities, that is the interception of phone calls, emails, text messages, and that it is not in the distant future where we can imagine private interests and state governments being able to spy on emails, Facebook posts, and tweets before you send them. It's not unrealistic where states, in fact, and private firms could intercept and read Microsoft Word files, text files, RTF files, and indeed all text files produced using ostensibly non-transmitting programs. And finally, it's possible that such surveillance could eventually be conducted in real time, where text documents could be intercepted even before one pressed save on one's program or committed the file to the cloud. What I'm going to discuss today is speculative, but that does not make it unreal. As Dag Spicer indicated, I teach in the history department at Stanford University in modern China and history of technology. I'm finishing up a project, a 2-volume project on the history of Chinese information technology from the advent of telegraphy in the 19th century all the way up to new media in the present day. And incidentally, I also have curated a museum exhibit, if anyone in the area is interested in joining, a museum exhibit dedicated to the Chinese typewriter, but also to other forms of modern information technology, which will be running through the end of August, early September. And if you would like any information about that, please head over to SaveTheChineseTypewriter.com, which is a little campaign that I'm running. OK. So as I did this research, or have conducted this research on Chinese typewriting computing, I could not have foreseen that the research would uncover materials of any relevance to contemporary political concerns about privacy, security, and civil liberties, but in fact, it did. And what has come to be known is that, in essence, there are keyloggers embedded into or baked into the very fabric of Chinese computing. A keylogger, I'm sure most of you know, is a device or a program that sits between the user's keystrokes and the computer program being used and intercepts and records them. This is how dubious spouses keep track of each other, dubious parents keep track of their children, and so forth. They have this sort of very semi-illicit quality to them. You can still purchase them on the commodity market, but they have this sort of dubious quality to them. In the early era of keylog spycraft, the principal challenges of such spycraft was not the production of these devices, but rather simply installing them on the machine. And one of the very first uses of keylog spycraft was a target of a mafia boss in which the FBI had to break into the office of their target, install the device on the machine, and then after a certain amount of time, break in a second time to retrieve that information back to get at passwords and so forth. As with the proliferation of malware, with the proliferation of other means, the installation of keyloggers on a device is much simpler, and yet the challenges still persist. There was one study recently that suggested that by hacking into the data in an Apple Watch, that one could, by tracking the movements of a user's hands, imperfectly guess at what that user was typing on their keyboard, for example. In the Chinese case, however, such ingenious ways of trying to guess at what the keystrokes are for a user are not all that necessary. There's much more direct ways to achieve this. This is simply by managing to intercept the keystrokes that are the basis of input. This is a screencast which will show you what a Chinese input screen on a standard laptop will look like. As you can see, the user is entering Latin alphabetic keystrokes using a system called Pinyin, which is the official romanization system of China, invented in the 1950s by Chinese linguists. And the system is intercepting those keystrokes and providing a set of candidates or possibilities to the user in a pop-up menu that sort of follows along. This system, this particular system, is a system called the Baidu Pinyin Input. It's one of the industry leaders. The industry leader is Sogo Pinyin Input. But there are many others. Google makes one, QQ makes one, Microsoft makes one, and they are already in every one of your laptops, whether or not you have a Windows or a Mac machine. So in essence, what an input method editor is a middleware software that's quietly running in the backdrop of everything that you would be doing, Microsoft Word, text editing, searching, and so forth, intercepting your keystrokes and using them as, in essence, criteria or instructions that the input method editor can use to search into the Chinese character database in the computer and bring back candidates that fulfill the criteria of what the user is looking for. And basically, as you see, it's constantly saying, do you want this? Do you want this? Do you want this? And the user is selecting them as he or she goes. So this is a still shot of what that looks like. This is a user entering a Tang Dynasty poem. And you can see that it follows along the bottom. And you can select the characters as you go. So input is at the core of Chinese computing and has always been ever since the advent of Chinese computing in the 1950s. Just to really pin down what input looks like and all the different ways that one could use it, this is just an example of how you would input a few terms of relevance to us in today's talk. Integrity, public opinion, and data privacy. So here are just two examples. In the top example, you see that you could enter the entire phonetic value, the entire sound or phonetic spelling of every one of the Chinese characters you want, as we saw in the previous screencast. But that is actually only one and the slowest means of inputting Chinese into using an input system. Instead, input systems now are intelligent enough that you can use all sorts of different abbreviations and shortcuts to achieve your goal, that is, the characters you want to see on the screen. So the character we want, hypothetically, is the word, the two-character word chengxin, meaning integrity. And so you could write out CHENGXIN using pinyin, but you could also enter the first consonantal vowels of both of those characters, C and X. And what the system will do is it will give you all meaningful two-character combinations in which the first character begins with a consonantal value C, and the second one begins with X. And it will rank them according to probability or statistical frequency. So as you can see, the character that we want, the two-character compound we want, is in the #1 position. So all I have to do is type CX and then the #1 to select it. Now next to that is another character, two-character compound, which is also meaningful in Chinese, chaoxi, meaning to plagiarize. And so if you write in CX, you would know that, oh, I want integrity, I don't want plagiarism. And so you type in 1. On the bottom, same thing. Now you can use an abbreviation for a 4-character sequence. Instead of writing out the full spelling of public opinion, as you can see on the bottom, YULUNDAOXIANG, you can do that. But that's the slowest way possible to input those 4 characters in the system. Instead, you could simply write YLDX. And the system will, again, present to you a set of candidates that are 4 characters long, in which each of the characters has the right consonantal vowel in the beginning. In this case, we have far fewer to choose from because there are more parameters. The first one is what we want. The second one is Yale University, Yale Daxue, which is also YLDX. And so we know we can choose integrity over plagiarism, public opinion over Yale University. And that's how we would go about this. So when we think about this, typing, as we understand it in the West, in the alphabetic world, which is premised on what you type is what you get, that you hit a keystroke, you expect the letter Q to appear on the screen. If you type the symbol with the letter O on it, you expect the O to appear on the screen. Typing in that what you see is what you get, what you type is what you get format does not exist in Chinese input. Typing has been dead in China for a long time and replaced by a totally different human-computer interaction called input, or 输入. OK. Now, if you think about this, input is a form of telecommunications. It is like sending a coded message over a system and then based upon a set of protocols at the sender and recipient era. But in this case, the arrow of transmission bends back on itself. And you are, in essence, telecommunicating with yourself. You are sending out coded, alphabetically coded transmissions intercepted by your computer, and then the computer decodes it and sends you back the plain text Chinese version of what you want. By virtue of this system, which has existed again in Chinese computing since the 1950s, every act of input is in one's way an act of transmission. And as we know, transmission it constitutes the moment in which surveillance becomes possible. Something has to move from one place to another in order for it to be intercepted. So we're going to walk through the history of how Chinese computing evolved, how input became what it was. And then finally, we're going to get into the final stage of this history, or the most recent stage of this history, the advent of an input technology known as cloud input, or 云输入, which is an input system that is now Wi-Fi enhanced, in which these telecommunications at a distance are leaving now, for the first time, leaving one's machine and coming back, at which point they become susceptible to actual interception. Now, as you could probably see, three pillars of Chinese computing from the start, not just in the last 10 years, but from the start in the 1950s onward. The three pillars of Chinese computing are input rather than typing, predictive text, and autocompletion. Predictive text and autocompletion in their actual administered form were not pioneered in the alphabetic world. They were pioneered in terms of their implementation in the Chinese character information technological environment. T9 was not the first widespread application of predictive text, and autocompletion that we see in our systems was not the first widespread application of this technology in text. So let's first look at input. Where did this come from? Well, input actually is not born with the Chinese computer of the 1950s. It is born with the last experimental Chinese typewriter, a mechanical Chinese typewriter invented in the 1930s and 40s and debuted to the world in the mid-1940s, really 1947, invented by a man named Lin Yutang, who was a New York Times best-selling author. He was a linguist. He was a polymath. He was one of the most respected cultural commentators of his time. This machine, never mass manufactured, I can go into that in the Q&A if you're interested, never mass manufactured, was an experimental prototype for a mechanical Chinese typewriter. And it was the first Chinese typewriter to have a keyboard. It was not the first Chinese typewriter. We're going to look at what those look like in a second. It was the first Chinese typewriter to have a keyboard. Now, we might not think of that as being all that interesting. A typewriter, by its very definition, is a thing with a keyboard, right? The answer, of course, is no. There's nothing in the definition of a typewriter that says it has to have a keyboard. It's just that's how we came to understand the keyboard in the early part of the 20th century. In the case of Chinese typewriting, ever since the first one was invented in the 1880s by a Christian missionary, which you see in the top left, and then finalized in the 1890s, DeVello Sheffield, every Chinese typewriter up until the 1940s that was prototyped and mass-produced. There was a typewriting industry in China in the teens and 20s and 30s and 40s. These were typewriters without keyboards, typewriters without keys. So if someone ever asks you, like a Zen koan, what is the sound of a typewriter with no keys, you can say, you know what, you think you're clever, but you're actually not, because there was an entire typewriting industry in China that was a typewriter with no keys. You probably won't be invited back to that cocktail party, but it's a nice thing to say to make yourself feel a little bit, superior. So anyway, this is what the Chinese typewriter looked like. Most notably, this machine down in the bottom right, the Shu Zhendong Chinese typewriter, mass-produced by the center of print capitalism in China throughout the teens, 20s, and 30s, commercial press. In the West, no one recognized these objects as typewriters because, again, people couldn't get their minds around the idea of a typewriter with no keys. And the Western world, by and large, made horrible fun of the Chinese typewriter for about a century and counting. One of the earliest comics in 1900, in the top left you see, is a phenomenally dehumanizing racist cartoon of so-called Chinese typists at what the cartoonist imagined must have been a massive keyboard with thousands and thousands of keys, one character per key. That idea carried its way all the way through the 20s and 30s. You see this cartoon in the middle, which was actually originally in Life magazine, and all the way to The Simpsons and Tom Selleck and MC Hammer. We've continued to make fun of the Chinese typewriter and imagine it as an impossibility. Well, Chinese engineers were not immune to this kind of criticism, this kind of mockery of Chinese information technology. And so there was this desire to build a typewriter that looked recognizable as a typewriter, that is, a typewriter with keys. The first man to do this, again, was Lin Yutang, who, and this is the keyboard as indicated in one of the documents connected with the typewriter, known as the Mingkuai typewriter. And what you'll notice, for anyone here who reads Chinese or recognize it, for others I'll just walk you through it, there are very few Chinese characters on this keyboard, okay? And the reason is that this machine was not designed to be a what you type is what you get system. It's not that you push one of these keys and the same character appears on the paper. No. Instead, the keyboard was used to rotate a set of gears inside the machine and to bring the desired character into the typing position through a three-stroke combination. The first keystroke would rotate the gears, but nothing would appear on the paper. The second keystroke would rotate it again. Nothing would appear on the paper. But after that second stroke, something would happen. The gears would be such that 8 characters would appear in a small device. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is, called the magic eye. In the chassis of the middle of the machine was a small kind of glass window that Lin Yutang called his magic eye. After the first keystroke and the second keystroke, 8 characters would appear in the magic eye. And then you, as the typist, would use the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to choose which one you wanted. Lin Yutang invented, in an entirely mechanical environment, this was not an electric machine, input, the first input method editor. Okay? This was a system designed to be a character retrieval and inscription machine, and had in that way not only departed from every Chinese typewriter ever to be built up until that moment, but every typewriter in the world ever designed and developed up to that moment. Now, when computing enters the picture in the 1950s, they immediately begin, in essence, to digitize this process. Okay? They take input out of the mechanical realm and bring it into one of logical circuits and so forth, but we'll get to that. The second pillar is predictive text, another one that the Western world likes to believe was pioneered, if not invented, then pioneered within the alphabetic realm. This is not true. Dag Spicer mentioned the piece that I composed. If anyone is interested in reading it, I'd be happy to share it. Which argues, in essence, that predictive text, as we understand it, was pioneered, again, in the mechanical realm of Chinese typewriting during the height of Maoism in the 1950s. So let's walk through what that means. Again, this is a Chinese typewriter. This is the one that was mass-produced in the late 19-teens, 20s, and 30s, until the typewriting market in China was taken over by a Japanese company, and Japanese companies became the dominant builders of Chinese typewriters in the wartime period. But this was the leading Chinese typewriter for about 2 decades. What you'll see is there is no keyboard, there are no keys. Instead, there is a tray bed, a zipan. And it's a matrix of characters of movable type metal slugs, not unlike doing letterpress at the Center for the Book or something like that, in a 35 by 70 grid matrix. And so that tray bed, if you were to take it and turn it over, they would all fall out. Okay? And with when using this machine, the way it would work, I'll try to do some body language. With your left hand, you would hold on to this bar over here, and you could move the actually, I guess the switches, later on the design has changed. Let's do it the 1930s style. With your right hand, you would hold on to that black knob in the front there, and you would be able to move the tray bed left and right, okay? With your left hand, you can move actually, you can move the whole thing in an XY coordinate. And what you're trying to do, sorry, the design changes later, is you're trying to bring the machine into a position such that the character you want is directly under the printing mechanism, which you can see at the back of the machine. So one way to think of it, if you do want to think in a keyboard framework, is imagine typing with one finger. Okay, you just want to bring the typing position over one of the 2,450 characters you want. Now, one of the things that's probably occurring to you is, how in the world does someone remember where these characters are? Well, simply put, the way you do that is by organizing these characters according to the leading dictionary organization of the time. I'm not going to go into detail about that. We can talk about it in Q&A. But basically, there is a system called radical stroke organization, which was the way that Chinese dictionaries in the early part of the 20th century were organized. If you were training to be a Chinese typist, you would know this. You would be able to sit down and find the characters that you want. But the problem was that since it's basically single key typing, the distance between characters that tended to go together in actual language, if they were far apart, that slowed the machine down, obviously. So just like in a dictionary, Apple and aardvark have nothing to do with each other, but for taxonomic purposes, they're right next to each other. The same principle was here. So you'd have typists who would start at one part of the tray bed and then need to go all the way to the other side. Maybe they come all the way back, then they go over here. And this was the organization system for the teens, 20s, and 30s. It was very good for a new typist learning the ropes because they didn't have to memorize a different system of organization. But it wasn't good for speed. In the 1950s, inspired by the Central People's Republic of China idea of mass science, of proletariat innovation, of user-led innovation, as in the contemporary parlance. Mao was a big user-led engineer kind of thinker. People were inspired to say, well, that's kind of a silly way to organize the tray bed. Let's take the tray bed, dump out all the characters, and then let's start building arrangements of characters that actually go together, that we use. Mao Zedong, I'm writing that every day, all the time. Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. So why don't I take the character Mao, Zedong, and put them together? And for that, why don't I put socialism together, science, student, all of these words that actually go together in my day-to-day life right next to each other? And so what people began to develop was entirely natural language arrangements of the Chinese language on their tray beds. And your predictive text machine and my predictive text machine would be different because you have a different set of things that you want to use in your day-to-day life. You have different mnemonic devices. And so it led to this decentralized natural language arrangement of characters. What ended up happening is the speed, I won't go into the Chinese part of this, but the speed tripled. The average typist using the earlier form of organization could type somewhere in the order of 20 characters per minute. Slower than alphabetic counterpart, no doubt. But after the reorganization of these characters, nothing changed to the machine. There was no electrical automation, no nothing. But just by reorganizing the characters, there were typists who were achieving speeds of 60 characters per minute, a 3-time increase in typing speeds. This is a heat map of a machine in the 1920s and 30s, in which the colors represent the number of characters in the adjacent slots on the matrix that character can be combined with to form an actual Chinese 2-character word. Okay? If you see the color is black, that means that the character in that slot cannot be combined with anything in its neighboring, anything in its up to 8 neighbors. If you see a bright red one, that means it can be combined with 5, 6, 7 of these characters, and therefore is very much faster if you're going to be producing those. This is what the machine looked like before this reorganization. This is what it looked like after. The whole machine lit up, heated up, sped up. Again, a 3-time increase. We can put them side by side. With the advent of Chinese computing in the 1950s, these natural language arrangements of the character database inside and also the retrieval protocols were lifted. They were taken directly from the realm of mechanical typewriting and brought into the realm of Chinese computing. So one way to think about this is, in the Western world, the typewriter marked a massive break with movable type. In the case of the Chinese typewriter, there is a much more intimate relationship between Chinese movable type and the typewriter. There wasn't really a schism. However, from typewriting to computing, at least when it comes to input, there is very little break in terms of from the typewriter to the computer in the alphabetic world. And there is a phenomenal break between Chinese typewriting and Chinese computing, and that's what we're getting at here. The third piece, the third pillar in this puzzle is autocompletion. The idea that every entity, every word, in the case of the Latin alphabetic words, alphabetic languages, and every 2 or more character Chinese word is, in a sense, informationally redundant. There is more there than we need in order to pinpoint, in order to retrieve it, let's say, in order to know what we're talking about. So the idea that if you type in, I don't know, B-R-I-T-T-A, oh, Britney Spears, it knows what you want. I don't know why. I was listening to a Britney Spears song on the way here, and that's in my mind somehow. OK, again, a lot of people imagine that autocompletion is a technology that is rather recent and also pioneered in the alphabetic world. In fact, we're close, but not quite there. It was first implemented in a systematic, large-scale way by an MIT engineer, Samuel Caldwell, who, despite the fact that he spoke not a single word of Chinese, invents the first Chinese computer. And here he is shown in a meeting in Taiwan. The format that he wanted to use is he wanted to use the QWERTY keyboard. Okay? He wanted to take that familiar platform and use it as a way of building a Chinese system. And this was inspired by the fact that MIT, then as now, this is 1953, MIT then as now was one of the global magnets for international students and international talent, and that included students from China. There were many, many students coming from China at that time studying at MIT. And for one reason or another, Samuel Caldwell and his wife would often have students over his house just to have meals and have conversations. In fact, Samuel Caldwell's wife was friends with Joyce Chun, the developer of the famous Chinese cookbook. And apparently, as the story goes, she would try out different types of Chinese cuisine, and presumably to help make these overseas Chinese students feel more at home. We don't know exactly how it happened, but a conversation ensued in which Samuel Caldwell asked or got into a conversation about Chinese characters with a student at MIT. And what he learned surprised him. It shouldn't have, but it surprised him, which is that if you take 2 or 3 or 4 separate Chinese-speaking individuals and ask them to write the same character, they will write it in the same order, the same stroke order. So in Caldwell's mind, he thought, oh, Chinese characters have a spelling? I didn't realize that. There's a systematic way that you write every character, and the answer was yes. He said, well, how many of these strokes are there? I say, well, people disagree, but basically it's in the teens, maybe around 20, 21, 22, depending on who you ask. And as a builder of logical circuits, and maybe a little bit later in his career, he thought, I could build that. And he set about building a system for the retrieval using a keyboard, which you'll see have strokes on them, have Chinese character strokes on the keyboard, to retrieve characters from within a photographic database. He set out on a study of all of 5,000 common characters. He enrolled the services and help of a professor of Chinese literature at Columbia University. They analyzed and broke down all of these characters into their component parts. He then did a statistical analysis of what strokes are more and less prevalent. He understandably assigned the more prevalent strokes with the least, this lowest code order, lowest number of code, and therefore he began to have a system. But along the way, he stumbled across something which he hadn't expected, even more so, which was the fact that Chinese characters are redundant. You don't need, in fact, to enter the entire spelling of a character in order for the system to say, I got it, you can stop now, I found it. And so he began to do a study between what he called the full spelling and the minimum spelling of Chinese characters. And he began to see that the difference was staggering, that some characters that have 19 strokes in them, if you wrote them out entirely, only require maybe 3 or 4 in minimum spelling for the machine to retrieve it. This idea of minimum spelling, or autocompletion as it would later be called, is picked up by every computer designer from that point on and becomes again, one of the 3 pillars of autocompletion, of Chinese input. So coming back to the question of surveillance, we're coming back basically to the 1980s, the 1990s. With these 3 pillars, input as the basic, the human-computer interaction umbrella that we're talking about today, within which predictive text and autocompletion are core elements of Chinese computing from the get-go. What you have over the course of the 70s and 80s is what's sometimes referred to as the input wars. There was a famous programming language wars in the 70s and 80s, which one would become dominant, exactly simultaneous to that. Hundreds and hundreds of Chinese linguists, entrepreneurs, engineers were trying to come up with different input systems to use the QWERTY keyboard to retrieve Chinese characters from those machines. All of those input systems lived and breathed entirely within the machines themselves. Of course, there was no internet, there was no Wi-Fi. It's all machine-bound. But they're getting faster and faster even in that context. In the 2000s, in the actually the 2010s really, something changes, something profound changes, which is that input joins the cloud. In something called Yun Shuru, you will have from that point on, not only in Sogo input, Baidu input, and then soon Microsoft input, Google input. This is becoming something that everyone is now moving towards if they haven't already. You will have one option in that little pop-up menu that has a little cloud next to it. It's hard to see. It's the blue one. It's got a little picture of a cloud. These ones, these ones with white are just the machine's own offerings. This one is the cloud's offerings. And as you can see, you can enter phenomenally long text strings. That one has ZHU, ZHANG, MANG, X. And it's guessing that, in this case, you want this long sentence. One of my favorites is actually in the, I snuck it into the title slide of my talk today, which is the name for Snowden himself, Si Nuodeng. If you type in SINUODENG, you'll get multiple offerings by the input system in its machine-bound way, number 1, number 3. But in the second one, and there the cloud is more visible. You see that tiny cloud next to number 2. That second offering by the input system is correct. That is the Chinese transliteration of Snowden's surname. Because, of course, many people, I did this actually around the 3-year anniversary, are talking about Snowden. He is in the cloud. Okay? So this raises the question. If Chinese input, not for malicious reasons, but for really ingenious reasons, has these, in essence, keyloggers baked into them, these systems called IMEs that intercept keystrokes, process them, give them back in plain text. In essence, when we talk about cloud input, we're talking about taking those keylogs and sharing them with the cloud. So in essence, this becomes telecommunication with oneself, but now sending it out far beyond one's own machine. So the question emerges whether or not unlike states turning to AT&T and Verizon and saying, under the guise of the Patriot Act or under some other legislation, we want you to turn over your phone records. If it's possible or conceivable in the future for a company to say, Baidu, Sogo, Microsoft, maybe not, well, maybe Microsoft, we want you to turn over your keylog inputs. These would be the raw material of what a computer user would be entering into their machine. Now, you might ask yourself, well, is there any identifying qualities to these inputs? I mean, if I were to look at your input and your input and your input, could I tell anything from that keylog. Anything, if I could see, not the Chinese characters, but the YIN, JUN, JIU, the XIA, MA, could I say anything about you? Could I know anything about you? And the answer is conceivably yes. At Stanford, I run a program called Digital Humanities Asia, DH Asia. One sub-part of which is a study of Chinese input, Chinese computing, and visualizations of what input is. This is a new human-computer interaction that we're not very familiar with yet. And so in a very basic preliminary study, I invited a group of users to input, to produce the same character output on their screen. In this case, a Tang Dynasty poem called Parting. And at the top, you can see, Xiama Yin Jun Jiu, and so forth and so on. Translation, the full dismount the horse and have some wine, I asked, to where are you going? And I invited, in this case, 3 people to sit down using whatever input system they wanted and to input this. And what you notice, it's a little bit hard to read, is that there are many more than one way to get the same screen output. Because I showed you, you can have abbreviations, shortcuts, you can spell out the whole thing, you can use the system in a very intelligent way. What you begin to see is that, and what we saw in the study, is that people have signatures. They have kind of signature qualities. They have ways they like to input. They have abbreviations they like to use repetitively. This is a 10-character sequence, and patterns, loosely speaking, using that word loosely, begin to emerge. Imagine this over thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of Chinese character input. You begin to have the capacity where even using a different system somewhere, that it might become possible to link or to attribute a keylog to an individual if you were able to triangulate enough of the variables. So this leads us to the opening remarks that I made. In the famous piece, Minority Report, that was butchered in film, but I'm sorry, Philip K. Dick imagined a world in which there existed such a thing called precrime, something that you could be liable for, penalizable for, prior to having committed the act, okay? If we are moving towards, again, this is speculative, but not necessarily unlikely. If we're moving towards an environment in which it becomes possible to intercept and read messages before they're sent, files that are never published, files, in fact, that you might type out exactly how you feel about person X, Y, or Z, and then delete it all, and never save it in the first place. Is it possible to imagine a future in which, if Wang Jingwei, one of the great late 1980s underground publishers in China, was imprisoned for writing essays, one of the most famous being The Fifth Modernization? Is it possible to imagine a world in which a future Wang Jingwei is arrested prior to ever publishing that essay? Is it possible to imagine a figure like Liu Xiaobo, who is incarcerated for his participation in the writing of another political, basically, letter to the editor? Is it possible to imagine a future in which a future Liu Xiaobo is incarcerated prior to ever having submitted it, and in fact, maybe having typed out and deleted it entirely? We're moving into a zone, in fact, in which this kind of human-computer interaction is becoming the new normal, not something exceptional to Chinese character input. If you read the pages of the Times just a few days ago, then you read more widely, you know that third-party keyboard systems, downloads, clients are becoming more popular. The idea of if you load this into your machine, you'll have augmented predictive text, autocompletion technologies, all of which are input method editors for the alphabetic world. This represents an entirely new realm of possibility and an entirely new realm in which everyday citizens around the world have to become vigilant and educated. And very specifically, and I'll make this closing remark as an historian of China, as a historian of Chinese technology, it becomes necessary for those of us in the alphabetic world to deeply familiarize ourselves with the history of information technology as it unfolded in a quarter of humanity, and about which we still know exceedingly little. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have. I believe the questions are coming on paper. Awesome.
There's just one.
OK, great.
Just one.
Great, thanks.
More coming.
All right, so they're coming in fast and furious now. All right. Thank you. OK, so let's see. The first question, Snowden only disclosed the scope of intercepts. Let's see. Terms known publicly for more than 30+ years. How have raw intercepts progressed from keywords word sequences? There's a little bit of abbreviation there. I have to autocomplete that question in my mind. Let me let my brain work on that for a second and move on to that. I couldn't quite parse this one. Wouldn't the government just keep track of IP addresses since cloud input has to be sent back to the user? So this is a question that I understand and I can address. The reason that I closed with the discussion of input signatures, the fact that different users have different strategies of Chinese input they tend to use, or they seem to tend to use repetitively, is that it actually wouldn't necessarily be enough simply to switch the machine or the IP address that one was using if one wanted to go undetected. So think about it that input signature could become a much more powerful version of typewriter forensics during the height of the Cold War. If anyone knows about this, you'll know about this. If not, if you've seen The Lives of Others, the brilliant German film about East Germany, and the scene where one of the members of the Secret Service is demonstrating different makes and models of typewriter. They know that based upon the ink, based upon the font, based upon the sort of servicing of the machine, they would keep catalogs of which dissident writer under surveillance was using what make and model of what machine, and therefore could, in a certain sense, attribute or try to attribute unattributed writings. In the case of input, if you had a Chinese character output essay, an essay, a blog entry, or so forth, on the one hand, that was unattributed, no one signed it. And on the other, you were able to intercept the actual underlying alphabetic key log that went into the production of that. It is conceivable, again, this is speculation, it's conceivable that signatures in that key log, the strategies that the individual used, the kinds of abbreviations, would allow that to be linked or compared against other known transcript Chinese character relations, and therefore have that unattributed transcript be identified. It's sort of like, how do you identify unattributed paintings if you're an art historian? That sort of dimension. So you undoubtedly would want to keep track of IP addresses if you were on the surveillant side of things, but they wouldn't be sufficient within and of themselves necessarily. I believe so I have some new questions. And I will come back once oh, thank you. OK. Will voice input like Siri solve this problem? This is a big question. One of the challenges of, there are two parts to this question. One of the challenges for moving towards voice recognition within, I guess, any context, but certainly the Chinese language context, is, as many people in the audience will undoubtedly know, the prevalence of so-called dialects of Chinese, which for all intents and purposes are actually languages. A Cantonese speaker, a Shanghainese speaker, a Mandarin speaker, a Fujianese speaker will not necessarily, and in most circumstances, will not be able to understand one another. And there are sub-dialects of each of these. Toisan in Cantonese, for example, but that's just one sub-dialect. And so the situation that you have in China right now is that there are as many dialect speakers who are not fluent in standard Chinese as there are speakers of German in the world, or as French in the world, maybe not French, but German. These are very large language communities. And so the idea that text will be bypassed and that the future is going to be spoken voice input is right around the corner is largely mythological, The other part of this, however, is we have to remember everything is writing, and everything is inscription, okay? When you speak that transcript into a voice recognition, it has to convert it into an inscription, let's say. In this case, it's a waveform. In this case, it is something inscribed. There is still some kind of transcript that is produced by that human-machine interaction, which, from the user's perspective, they never see. It gets thrown away. They don't know what happens to it. It either succeeds or fails by seeing characters come up on the screen or not. But there's this process where some sort of transcript is being recorded and thrown away. What we've talked about here is where that transcript is quite literally letters of the Latin alphabet. It's conceivable to imagine where that transcript are waveforms. And so this idea of something that is sitting in between intercepting and translating and keeping a record of itself still stands. It would just be a very different, arguably much more complex, but still a different kind of puzzle. How is this any different from intercepting email and text messages? It is, on the one hand, no different at all, except if anyone here has ever drunk texted or drunk emailed, you know that there is a big difference between the email you send and the email you don't. Okay? One is being sent out over the wire or a phone call being made, and therefore we have become, unfortunately, quite kind of inert, maybe even numb to the idea that some private or public sector force could be intercepting that transmission. We have not come around in our thinking to imagine that the text you write and then delete, the email you write and then get rid of, we have no concept in our mind of that being watched or that being intercepted because we understand that act as not an act of transmission. I didn't send it to anybody. It's still here. But what I'm getting at with this discussion is that at least in the context of Chinese input, all text input is at some fundamental level an act of transmission. And as we've now come to realize, every act of transmission is by its very nature theoretically susceptible to interception. Okay? So that's the difference. The basic principle of it is the same, but the context of it is radically different and much, much more extensive. Are there countermeasures against IME snooping? I like that. Input method editor snooping, like flooding the cloud with certain words and phrases. That's a really great idea. Undoubtedly, yes. In fact, you can turn the story of Chinese input around, and also, I mean, this entire essay, this entire sort of discussion we're having about a speculative reality could be flipped in which how would one want to use the baked-in functionality of Chinese input to create a code, okay? For example, because it's a two-way street. You can have Latin letters get turned into characters. But in theory, you could also send characters. You could send an email that are characters across the wire, and that the recipient understands that, oh, what I'm supposed to do to decode the message is to type in the pinyin value of those characters back into some sort of, I'm supposed to basically do this in kind of reverse order and get at some sort of encoded underlying message. There are ways, the human-computer interaction that is input, which is one that the alphabetic world is only coming to experience arguably in the last decade in any sort of serious way, offers up entirely new possibilities for this ongoing cat and mouse game of surveillance and counter-surveillance. So I think the answer is undoubtedly yes. What they are, I don't know. I don't know what they are. Is it said the Chinese alphabet is made of 20,000 plus words? Oh, I'm sorry. It is said that the Chinese alphabet is made of 20,000 or more words. How do they manage it with 23 keys on a typewriter? OK. So a few quick things. One is there is no such thing as the Chinese alphabet. It's sort of like common parlance to say that, but Chinese characters, Chinese writing have no letters, no syllabic writing, no alphabetic writing. But it is true that the Chinese lexicon, that is the total quantity of all Chinese characters put together, depending on who you ask, either weighs in at 70,000 plus And then there are dictionaries that have some duplication, which exceed 100,000 characters. Okay? So how do you fit that onto a machine? And you've actually, whoever asked this question, it's a brilliant question. This was the question of the 19th and 20th century. It was the question in the age of telegraphy. How do you fit tens of thousands of characters in Morse code? It was in typewriting. How do you fit it onto a typewriter? In punch card computing, how do you fit it onto a punch card? Basically, this is the story of the 19th, 20th, 21st century. That's what the books I just finished are about. The answer is that you don't put them on the keys. That is mind-boggling in the alphabetic world, because in the alphabetic world, the whole idea is that for every letter, there's a key. That's the way it works. And if I want a letter, I hit the corresponding key. Chinese input departs from that entirely and says, in essence, let's hack the keyboard and treat it, in essence, like a MIDI instrument, a musical instrument, digital interface instrument. For anyone here that does any music and knows anything about music, you'll know that in the 1950s and 1960s, with the advent of electronic music, the MIDI revolution, is that you could have controllers, they were called, or they still are, that looks like a piano, but when you press the keys, the sounds of drums come out, or strings, or the oboe. You can play a piano-shaped MIDI controller. You can play the cello with a piano. You can play the drums with a flute, because they're also flute MIDI controllers. In essence, MIDI is a very good way of thinking about what input is, because this is basically starting in the late 40s, 1950s. Engineers figured out how to play Chinese with the QWERTY keyboard, okay? And to disconnect the idea that the instrument and the sound have to have this total one-to-one correspondence, that Q equals Q. Let's forget that. When you forget that, when you give up on what you type is what you get, things get really crazy, really fast, and really interesting really fast. So one of the ways you do it is you take the characters and you sequester them away, not from the naked eye view, put them in a database. And then what you're fitting onto the keyboard are just the letters or symbols that you need to tell the machine what characters you want it to retrieve from inside this database. You turn your machine into a retrieval system rather than what you type is what you get way. That's how you fit tens of thousands of characters onto a keyboard. OK. How long did it take to train on the different Chinese typewriter and digital text editors? So typing schools, Chinese typing schools, began to emerge and proliferate in China and then in Taiwan and elsewhere in the 19-teens, especially in the 20s and 30s. And you would have young women, actually, and young men. Unlike the Western world, where typewriting becomes the domain of women secretaries very quickly, in the Chinese context, that is not true. It's still predominantly women, but it's something like a 70-30, 60-40 split. There are actually many male typists in China. That changes when the QWERTY keyboard. When the QWERTY keyboard comes in, the Chinese secretarial labor force feminizes exactly like the rest of the world. It's an interesting story that we can talk about if you're interested. But in one of these schools, a middle school educated young boy, young girl would come in and study a few hours a day, a few days a week for about 3 months, and they would get a certificate. Okay, it was basically a way that someone could get into a vocational career and so forth. It wasn't highly intensive, but there was a great deal of memory work that had to happen. And in fact, every time I check out at the grocery counter and my wife likes to get, my wife's from Italy, and she likes to get some various Italian vegetables, which always send the grocery clerk wondering, what's the code for this? And there's always this discussion like, is this? And inevitably, someone can say, oh, that's 73297. I'm like, OK, let me just ask you. I'm always, how long did it take you to memorize that? Like, where did you, is there a mnemonic device? Because I'm always thinking about the fact that typists who were learning the code points or the positions of 2,500 characters, what were the kinds of techniques and memory devices that one used? Because it was actually highly technical. Yeah, so it's fascinating. Do we have any more questions? No? I think I need to wind. I love talking to you. Also, let's let the hook pull me aside. And I just want to thank you one last time for allowing me to speak with you today.